well, they definitely don't help, for sure. So, alrighty. So, I know yesterday I talked about the law, the model legislation that's been put forward to deal um, with the DEI statements. But, I saw this article in the National Review and I wanted to talk about it because it suits an idea that has been bothering me and why I like things like Heterodox Academy and others who are considering certain things, because it is kind of a true statement and something to keep in mind for those of us who are fighting against the censorship and against First Amendment issues and things like that. But fight university censorship, but don't neglect the big picture from the National Review. We cannot let our universities become seminaries for the priests of pre-selected social justice causes. The censorious mob strikes again. Recent weeks have seen universities assault the right of scholars to speak freely. Amy Wax of the University of Pennsylvania and Ilya Shapiro of Georgetown Law are the latest victims of a crazed zeal to purge the scholarly community of heterodoxy. I will say in Ilya Shapiro's case, the Academic Freedom Alliance has also chimed in on this and said, don't you dare fire her, don't you dare fire him, rather, don't you dare suspend that person, those kinds of things. So the Academic Freedom Alliance has actually chimed up in defense of Ilya Shapiro recently. We are right to be incensed at the silencing of scholars, provocative though they sometimes are. Yet a hyperfixation on combating university censorship risks obscuring the bigger picture, and with it, bigger challenges. Our cries should be stronger than, quote, don't silence so-and-so, and, quote, tenure protects such and such. We must call on universities to actively promote a culture of free inquiry and protect educational vision that prioritizes the pursuit of knowledge over partisan activism. Unless we do, the battle for academic freedom is a lost cause. And that is the point that I think needs to be made, and what I don't see a whole lot from the unwoke. Well, not the unwoke, the anti-woke. Sorry, I'm wrong phrasing there, but the don't see it a whole lot just from like anti-woke kind of things. It's like, no, protecting people is one thing, but you gotta get in there, and particularly with the universities, and I think of the University of Austin, that they need to do this too. How do you go about promoting a culture that is okay with free inquiry again and what have you? Because, I mean, it wasn't always the case that universities have become what they are now, which tends to be a little bit censorious, and not liking divergent viewpoints. And I have a different article I want to do tomorrow that's going to relate to that, particularly for science, and talk about that, because I think it makes a great point, and and it relates to the current issues of our time. But this is a big deal. I mean, it's one thing, and should be screaming bloody murder if you're defending free speech and academic freedom, regardless of the professor in question, whether or not you agree with them or not. You should not be silencing them for what they're saying, and you should not necessarily be making them face disciplinary action just because somebody's offended. To be cradles of knowledge, universities must respect an array of norms that are indispensable to truth-seeking as oxygen is to life. In addition to honoring the elementary non-censorship rule and avoiding tyrannical double standards, universities should strive to root out institutional biases that suggest limitations on the scope of acceptable inquiry. When universities meet this challenge, they promise a culture where dissent is enthusiastically embraced. When they don't, academic cultures atrophy. So, I've said this many times, science relies very much... Science is the purpose of science, the telos of science, as we've said many times, and as my firm belief, is the pursuit of the truth. It is not some social justice activism bent. It is not political advocacy and what have you. And, some weird thought that I've been having is there's been a lot of arguments in the past among different scientists about how much scientists should be advocates for something. And I wonder actually if scientists should be deliberately, in some cases, should be politically homeless in terms of whatever political party they have, because their job is the pursuit of the truth, regardless of whatever may be going on otherwise. And so I wonder something about that, whether or not scientists should be politically homeless. And that may be something I get into in this channel. As sort of I haven't done a philosophical topic video in a long time related to science, and I may do that. Something like how should scientists be advocates? Should scientists be activists? Kind of things. For anything other except the proper application and pursuit of the truth associated with scientific process. But but that's the interesting part about it is, right now that doesn't seem to be what's of interest. The idea of truth seeking is not necessarily something that is of most interest in most of the things I hear. And it's like the article I have for Thursday Review this week is one of them, where it is far more interested in power than it is in the truth. And that is antithetical to the purpose of science if you're more interested in power than you are in the pursuit of the truth. So that's the thing, is that if your goal is power, then you don't necessarily want any dissent, right? And you can't have any, you have to have limitations on acceptable inquiry. And that's my concern with the universities right now, is that they don't necessarily do a well enough job to allow students and professors and staff who are engaged in research in particular, but and even just in teaching, to explore and to think and to go chasing some interesting ideas and be truth seeking, as much as they would like. But and it's in part because some of the crazy things that we've talked about, the FIRE college free speech rankings, we've talked about the Heterodox Academy survey, and what have you, and it just gets crazy. But let's continue. And atrophy they have at my own Princeton University. Students are greeted at their very arrival on campus with a freshman orientation program drenched in hypocrisy, double standards, and indoctrination a la Mao. Nicely done there. Events that masquerade as innocuous trainings to promote sexual health are just as much partisan boot camps for exponents of liberationist sex ethic. Students are given pornographic, sex-positive comic books and participate in crass sex toy giveaways. They attend mandatory LGBT panels where mainstream ideas about sex and gender are presented as bigoted falsehoods long dispelled by the real experts, aka activists. And this is, again, it's one thing to be, I've often heard the pushback on the indoctrination argument being, well, we're just exposing them to different ideas. We're just exposing them to new ideas. But if you're talking about a student who's, up until the point they get into college, have been taught, this is the way things are, this is the way this is, rather than being taught how to think, they've been taught what to think and look for what is the correct answer on the test, then they're still very susceptible to the idea that, okay, well, maybe this whole thing I've been presented with is wrong, and these people are an authority on this, and they're telling me this is the right thing, so I'm going to listen to that. So that doesn't necessarily help, and that's what folks are concerned about, is the question, are you trying to promote a specific set of ideas that suit your political worldview, or are you indeed interested in exposing folks to those ideas and letting them come to their own conclusions and developing the tools in that person to help them come to those conclusions? A lot of those tools are incredibly important to doing scientific research. Being able to think and reason through things kind of matters. And so I can understand the concern about, academic freedom that comes from the pushback to cancel culture. I can understand some of it, but at the same time understand what others are concerned about, that, well, are you really just exposing to different ideas, or are you actually, trying to force your ideas onto others through these kinds of things? Anyway, orientation panels on racial and other forms of justice are similarly one-sided. University officials slander their own tenured professors for expressing ideas most Americans call common sense. Students are coerced into confessing their sins, wealth, whiteness, and privilege in front of thousands of kids they met just days before. If you're wondering whether any of this is supplemented by a serious exhortation that students cherish heterodoxy, ideological difference, and inherent value of truth-seeking, I am sorry to say you'll be disappointed. And that is indeed not what goes on if those kinds of things are happening. You're not taught that ideological diversity matters, but you're told this thing matters, and you are bigoted if you don't agree. And that kind of forces people to agree with these things, and that kills viewpoint diversity very quickly, indeed, and it is a concern. But if that kind of culture is entrenched, how do what kind of culture do you need to actually have the opposite, where having dissenting opinions is okay and you're not treated as someone horrible for having a dissenting opinion? It's a very different kind of thing there. The double standards and entrenched biases don't stop after freshman orientation. They persist, and a hollowed culture results. Students are programmed to think that they must profess the creed of woke intelligentsia to be counted among society's enlightened. Brilliant students cower in fear of cancellation. My friends won't take classes in departments they know will flunk them for arguing in favor of reasonable but unorthodox ideas. Professors table hot topics because they fear a self-righteous 18-year-old who will file a DEI complaint. Perspectives that wouldn't have caused anyone to bat an eye a few years ago are now cause for uproar. For example, to argue that our existence as embodied persons invalidates the new racial gender ideology is to enact violence on a marginalized community. To openly support the police means you'll be ousted from your leadership role on your sports team. To speak up as a pro-life woman means your peers and professors will cast you off as an unsophisticated zealot. These examples are not hypothetical, nor are they merely anecdotal. The stats astound. The Heterodox Academy's Campus Expression Survey reveals that a staggering 62% of college students, are afraid to speak their minds. The Foundation for Individual Rights in Education suggests the number is 80%. FIRE also informs us that the majority of college students, 66%, support speaker shutdowns, and nearly a quarter support the use of actual violence to stop some forms of speech. You got to be careful with that. I know I did a video on this, and some of the way that this is presented is disingenuous. As much as I appreciate the perspective here, I do have to point out some of that. I did a video on this, and you have to be careful because what they're lumping in is, the support of who support it in some circumstances versus, all circumstances or things like that gets lumped in with when they're talking about that particular one of a quarter or the speaker shutdowns kind of thing. They're talking about the varying levels of support versus the folks who would never support it under any circumstance. So there's a little bit of variation in those numbers that need to be aware. The other thing I got to point out is some of the framing is a little bit missing here, because this is talking specifically about, woke versus not woke, but this is also right here. These numbers here are not just conservative and liberal students that are mentioned in here, though there is a breakdown for that, I think, in the Campus Expression Survey, if I remember correctly. So I would just point that out, that there's a little bit missing here from what the National Review is saying with this. And just a point, not that I disagree, actually, because I myself would count myself as one of those people who have been very afraid to speak my mind on a college campus at this point. So I have been there, I have done that, and still happens on occasion. But, this kind of stuff that they're talking about, none of it bodes well to viewpoint diversity. And, same thing on the flip side. If there was a reverse of this, having someone who was pro-choice speaking up at a place where it was dominantly pro-life or something like that, you might get cast off the other way in some cases. So either version of this, whether it's, either version of this is the example here of woke, but if it's also the version of, in a conservative sense, you're afraid to speak up when you're in minority liberal, that's just as bad of a problem. And it doesn't help develop the freedom of speech here and the culture that allows for open inquiry on a campus. Of course, demands for universities to confront discourse-suffocating biases will fall flat if we don't fight their deeper cause, a warped vision of higher education. Universities are beginning to adopt official institutionalized social justice causes, prioritizing their own activism through one-sided programming initiatives and centers. Unsurprisingly, the partisan bureaucrats who have jettisoned the truth-seeking ideal in favor of this new vision see academic freedom as its concomitant norms as mere side constraints, malleable inconveniences to be dispensed with for the sake of predetermined social justice initiatives. To DEI tyrants, open cultures of inquiry look like arbitrary relics of an unfashionable, unprofitable, and outdated notion of what universities do. As one all too candid professor admitted to my freshman peers, quote, free speech and intellectual discourse are defensible only insofar as they are, quote, flexed to one specific aim, the promotion of social justice and an anti-racist social justice at that. This conception of intellectual freedom is jarring and shameful, but it is not unique. Okay, one thing I want to make a point on with this is that that is a really, really scary kind of thing right there. That's that. But that, I believe, goes to Herbert Marcuse's repressive tolerance, that you can only have tolerance of speech if it is aligned up with your own political ideals, and that's where that comes from. So I would say that is not surprising necessarily to see it, but that does come from postmodern thought, and Herbert Marcuse comes up with that. So it's very much there, but it also falls in line with the notion that if power is more important in these kinds of things, then yeah, the truth doesn't matter. And that is something you got to figure out, is it power or is it the truth that matters the most in these kinds of things? And it's really, really, really disgusting here. Ending university censorship is a noble cause of an urgent battle, but defenders of free speech mustn't risk myopia or tunnel vision. There is a bigger war worth fighting. We cannot let our universities become seminaries for the priests of pre-selected causes. A dispassionate commitment to truth-seeking must remain the priority. It is this vision that, in our advocacy, we cannot neglect. Yeah, that's true. I'm disappointed, actually, with this piece because he's not giving a good example of how he would go about doing that. Although, truthfully, I have seen some good examples in other places that I think would be useful. One of the things that I like is actually Bucknell's Open Discourse Coalition, where they regularly have two people with very different viewpoints, and sometimes their debate gets very heated in there. And that just says, get in there and go to town and have an argument and duke it out verbally, thank you, not with your fists or anything else, but you end up you may find no common ground other than you're both human beings, we disagree on the issue, but let's go have a beer afterwards. That's the kind of thing that I think needs to start happening more so. And I'm also thinking about it from the standpoint of tech, because I'll get into this more, I think, on the video for tomorrow, but I don't think social media has helped with science at all. Communicate fast, yes. But there's something about what social media has done with advancing the group think and the, for lack of a better word, tribalism kind of ideas with scientists also. Scientists are people. They are no less susceptible to some of these kinds of things than others. No amount of degrees makes you any less human and any less susceptible to the problems of being human. So it's certainly interesting that way. I would love to see, so if Miles sees this, I would like to see if he's got any thoughts, because I agree with him in a lot of ways, but I would, like I said, I had some problems with the framing because he's pointing out only one side of the argument, and those surveys with the Heterodox Academy and FIRE and what have you cover all students left and right there. So that's just a point I just want to make on that. But I would be curious what his thoughts would be on how to do that, because that was the thing I think is missing from this particular article, is that he does not get into this article and say, what are some ways that we could reintroduce that. And some of it is going to take a long time to change the university kind of culture. And I wonder, does it need to start from K through 12? Do you need to take back K through 12 first and make sure you bring back the humanization of different divergent viewpoints there alongside the people that are there before you can get into K through 12 kind of into higher education kind of stuff. But it's certainly fascinating. And I think this is an excellently done article in terms of the idea that you really can't ignore it. I'm disappointed he didn't go a little bit further with it and actually think of some ideas, because I want to see, truthfully, I think one of the easiest things to do would be, we're going to have professor here, or even just somebody outside the university here. But the requirement afterwards is, you got to go out afterwards and have a beer and just sit and chat. and all the students can come to who are of drinking age. Those kinds of things I think would actually be fantastic to do. You need to, because one of the things I think we've forgotten, in particularly in this internet age, is that the person who has a different idea from you is still human. They're still amazingly human people. You can still be, for lack of a better way to describe it, you can still be friends with somebody even if you completely disagree with a lot of their ideas. It's harder, and you might sometimes get into some interesting disagreements, but you might find each other as being human, and you're less likely to try and ruin somebody's life, or you're more likely to stick up for somebody whose life is being attacked if you can recognize them as a human being rather than the person on the other side of the keyboard, or the person who has a different idea from you that you don't agree with. But these kinds of things that are being done, that are described here, which he's describing from his experience at Princeton, varying degrees of which exist elsewhere, I think they definitely don't help, for sure. So, but that's my thoughts on that, and I think the young gentleman is quite correct that we can't forget that even as we try to stop the censoriousness of campus, that we don't forget that we need to actually remember the bigger picture, that we can't forget either that you have to have a society, you have to have a culture at a university that wants to embrace these kinds of truth-seeking as being important, and being okay with dissent, and most importantly, humanizing people who do dissent, rather than dehumanizing them. And that is the thing that I would think there, because if it doesn't happen, again, my concern is always, what does this mean for science going forward? Is if we end up dehumanizing anybody who disagrees and being taught that that's okay to do, you end up wrecking science, because you can't have divergent viewpoints at that point if you're told that anybody who disagrees with me is wrong, is evil, is any number of different things. So let me know what you think on the thoughts here. What would be your thoughts on how to get the culture of open inquiry back at a university? Or do you think the universities are too far gone? Part of me is like, they're too far gone. Part of me is like, well, what can we do? So let's get some thoughts on that. If you like the video, hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good jazz. And don't forget, come on over to shiasophia.locals.com if you'd like to join us for some exclusive behind the scenes content. I recently posted something, apparently we trust synthetic faces more than real ones. Fun study that I found recently. Anyway, that's it for now, and until next time, I'm Adrian, and I hope you all stay curious.